Most histories of World War II describe battles, strategies, and political decisions. But there was another battlefield that shaped daily life across Europe and Asia, the kitchen table, often empty, sometimes improvised, and frequently transformed into a site of survival experimentation. Civilian hunger during the war wasn't simply temporary hardship. It reshaped agricultural policy, urban planning, food science, and modern emergency preparedness. Entire populations learned, through necessity, how to turn landscapes, waste products, and even cultural taboos into calories. Many of the foods people relied on were never meant to be eaten at all. Some damaged health in ways that lasted decades. Others permanently altered national diets. A few became symbols of collective trauma. Understanding these foods reveals something war histories often miss. Survival is rarely dramatic. It is incremental, improvised, and deeply rational under pressure. If you value careful historical analysis of how people actually endure collapse, subscribe to the Survival Record now. What follows are 9 of the most striking foods civilians turned to when normal supply systems failed, and what those choices reveal about resilience, scarcity, and the mechanics of survival. When bread itself disappeared, people began stretching flour with whatever could physically resemble it. Across large parts of Europe, particularly in Germany and occupied territories, grain shortages became so severe that bread, normally the most dependable staple, had to be artificially extended. Bakers mixed flour with sawdust, ground straw, pulverized leaves, or shredded paper pulp. These were not symbolic additions. They were structural fillers meant to preserve the shape and chew of bread while drastically reducing the amount of actual grain required. The resulting ersatz bread provided minimal nutrition and, honestly, often caused digestive problems. But authorities encouraged or even mandated its production because bread carried enormous psychological importance. Maintaining the appearance of normal food helped stabilize morale. A recognizable loaf, even if it was nutritionally compromised, reinforced the sense that society still functioned. From a survival perspective, this reveals a critical principle. In prolonged scarcity, maintaining routine can matter almost as much as maintaining calories. Modern emergency food programs still reflect this understanding. Texture, familiarity, and portion structure influence perceived sufficiency, even when nutritional density declines. In besieged cities, boiling leather actually became a legitimate method of extracting nutrition. During the siege of Leningrad in the Soviet Union, civilians systematically dismantled everyday objects, belts, boots, harnesses, and boiled them into a sort of gelatinous broth. Leather contains collagen, which breaks down into protein-rich gelatin after prolonged cooking. Under siege conditions, this biochemical fact became widely understood practical knowledge. This was not merely desperate improvisation, it reflected rapid adaptation through shared information. When traditional food systems collapse, communities begin to analyze materials around them in functional nutritional terms. Anything containing protein, fat, or digestible compounds becomes a candidate for conversion. The siege later influenced Soviet civil defense thinking. Post-war planning emphasized training civilians to identify alternative nutritional sources within existing material environments. Survival knowledge, in a real sense, became institutionalized. In occupied and rural regions, tree bark was processed into flour rather than consumed raw. In parts of northern and eastern Europe, inner tree bark, especially from pine, was dried, ground, and mixed into flour. Unlike sawdust fillers, bark flour contained small amounts of nutrients, including fiber and trace minerals. More importantly, it provided bulk and helped extend grain supplies. This technique was not new. It had been used during earlier famine periods, particularly before industrial agriculture stabilized food availability. Wartime scarcity revived practices that had largely disappeared from living memory. Communities rediscovered inherited knowledge stored in older generations, local tradition, and historical memory. From a long-term perspective, this really demonstrates how cultural knowledge can function as a survival reserve. Skills that appear obsolete during stability may become essential under systemic disruption. The Netherlands endured a famine winter in which tulip bulbs replaced staple crops. During the 1944-45 famine, known as the Honger Winter in the Netherlands, food supply networks collapsed almost entirely. Tulip bulbs, normally cultivated for ornamental export, became one of the few available sources of carbohydrates. Civilians peeled, boiled, and sometimes ground them into flour. But tulip bulbs were not inherently safe food. They required careful preparation to reduce toxic compounds. Unofficial guidance circulated, explaining proper methods. The fact that governments and medical authorities actively published preparation instructions shows just how thoroughly agricultural norms had been inverted. A luxury export crop had become a survival staple. After the war, Dutch agricultural policy shifted toward greater domestic food resilience. The experience demonstrated the danger of relying too heavily on specialized export agriculture when transport systems can be disrupted by military conflict. Urban populations, gradually incorporated animals that were once considered, socially unacceptable to eat. In heavily bombed or blockaded cities, conventional meat supplies just disappeared quickly. Civilians began trapping pigeons, rodents, and other kinds of urban wildlife. In some cases, household pets also, unfortunately, entered the food chain. This actually occurred in multiple countries, including the United Kingdom and Japan, particularly during periods of intense bombing or isolation. What really stands out historically is the speed at which these practices became normalized. Municipal authorities sometimes even issued guidance on the safe preparation of unconventional meats. Once survival required it, cultural prohibitions weakened rapidly, especially when official institutions acknowledged the reality. We see this pattern consistently in extreme scarcity. Social taboos surrounding food are in fact conditional, not fixed. Under systemic stress, nutritional value overrides tradition. Acorns were, interestingly enough, transformed into a widely consumed coffee substitute. Coffee imports collapsed across much of Europe during the war. In response, civilians roasted acorns, ground them, and brewed a rather bitter beverage that resembled coffee. The process required soaking to remove tannins which otherwise caused digestive problems. Acorn coffee, of course, did not replicate caffeine's stimulant effects, but it fulfilled something equally important: routine and psychological continuity. Warm beverages prepared through familiar rituals provided structure in otherwise unstable conditions. This really reflects a survival insight that modern military ration planning still recognizes: morale. Supporting foods can have measurable psychological value, even when their nutritional contribution is quite limited. Turnips became a national symbol of deprivation and actually shaped future food policy. Although the most infamous turnip winter occurred during World War I, its legacy deeply influenced World War II planning. During severe shortages caused by blockade and crop failure, German civilians were forced to subsist almost entirely on turnips, normally used as livestock feed. The memory of this experience shaped government priorities in the following decades. Leaders recognized that visible famine undermined civilian morale and political stability. Ensuring access to staple calories became a strategic objective, not merely a humanitarian concern. Food security, in this sense, emerged as a pillar of national defense. Industrial byproducts entered civilian diets when traditional supply chains failed. In regions where industrial production continued but food transport collapsed, civilians consumed processed waste from manufacturing, oilseed residue, fermentation mash, and other nutrient-containing byproducts. This happened in parts of occupied Europe and also in regions of the United States where rationing reshaped distribution patterns. Authorities sometimes issued instructions identifying which byproducts could be safely consumed after processing. The boundary between industrial input and food supply became, increasingly blurred. This experience influenced post-war development of processed emergency rations and nutritional concentrates. Materials once considered waste were reclassified as potential food resources. Governments and civilians systematically catalogued wild plants as nutritional resources. Botanical knowledge expanded dramatically during wartime scarcity. Governments distributed pamphlets identifying edible grasses, nettles, and wild greens. Urban populations, many with little prior experience in foraging, learned to identify and harvest plants from parks, roadsides, and vacant land. Foraging shifted from an informal rural practice to an organized civilian strategy. Entire populations were taught to interpret their environment in nutritional terms. Modern survival manuals still draw heavily from these wartime botanical guides, which remain among the most widely distributed civilian foraging references ever produced. So, what do these overlooked food choices actually reveal about survival under total war? Civilian hunger during World War II was not simply the absence of food. It was really the collapse of systems that define what food is. People reclassified materials, revived dormant knowledge, and restructured cultural norms to preserve life day by day. These adaptations influenced military doctrine, civil defense planning, agricultural policy, and emergency preparedness long after the war ended. Governments learned that resilience is not only about stockpiles, it is about knowledge, flexibility, and the capacity to redefine necessity. Remembering what families actually ate during wartime reveals a dimension of conflict that closely parallels modern vulnerabilities, supply chain disruption, infrastructure failure, and prolonged resource scarcity. These are not distant historical curiosities. They are, in fact, survival case studies. If you value thoughtful, in-depth historical analysis of how ordinary people endure extraordinary breakdowns, subscribe to the Survival Record and share this video. Understanding these stories helps ensure they remain lessons, not warnings,